The violence started in Nogales, Arizona on a Tuesday morning in March. Two vehicles collided at an intersection near the border crossing. What appeared to be a traffic accident quickly escalated when occupants from both vehicles opened fire on each other in broad daylight. 4 men were killed in the exchange. Another 6 were wounded. Witnesses reported at least 40 gunshots fired in less than 2 minutes. Local police initially treated it as gang violence. But when DEA agents examined the identities of those killed, they recognized the signatures of something larger. The victims weren't street-level gang members. They were mid-level operatives associated with competing Mexican drug trafficking organizations. 2 were connected to the Sinaloa Cartel. 2 were linked to Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. The shootout wasn't random gang conflict. It was the opening move in a territorial war over control of drug distribution routes through Arizona. For 15 years, the Sinaloa cartel had dominated trafficking operations through Arizona's border crossings and distribution networks. They controlled smuggling routes from Nogales and Douglas into Phoenix and beyond. They managed relationships with transportation companies that moved drugs to markets across the western United States. They operated with relative stability, minimizing violence that would attract law enforcement attention. But Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación had been expanding aggressively throughout Mexico, challenging Sinaloa's dominance in multiple regions. CJNG had grown from a regional organization into a national power by using extreme violence and sophisticated business operations. Now they wanted access to Arizona's lucrative distribution infrastructure. Sinaloa wasn't willing to share. The conflict escalated rapidly over the following weeks. 3 transportation company offices in Phoenix were firebombed within a 10-day period. The companies had been moving legitimate cargo while also facilitating drug shipments for Sinaloa. CJNG was destroying infrastructure they couldn't control. If they couldn't use the routes, they would ensure Sinaloa couldn't either. Sinaloa retaliated by targeting CJNG operatives attempting to establish operations in Tucson. 5 men associated with the rival organization were found dead in a remote area outside the city. The message was clear. Arizona belonged to Sinaloa, and attempts to establish CJNG presence would be met with lethal force. DEA intelligence analysts watched the escalation with concern and opportunity. Cartel conflicts created chaos that disrupted operations and generated intelligence as organizations became less cautious in their communications and movements. The violence also provided legal justification for enhanced surveillance and investigation of both organizations. The war was fundamentally about business. Arizona's position on the southern border made it critical infrastructure for drug trafficking. Routes through the state connected production facilities in Mexico with distribution networks serving Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Denver, and cities across the western United States. Control of these routes meant billions of dollars in revenue annually. Sinaloa had built this infrastructure over decades. They had corrupted officials, established transportation networks, and developed distribution relationships that made their operations efficient and profitable. CJNG wanted access to this established system rather than building their own from scratch. But Sinaloa viewed sharing as a weakness that would eventually lead to complete displacement. The conflict revealed details about trafficking infrastructure that had remained hidden during periods of stable operations. As the cartels fought for control, they inadvertently exposed their networks to law enforcement surveillance. Safe houses used by both organizations were identified when violence occurred at or near these locations. Transportation routes became visible as both sides attempted to intercept each other's shipments. Surveillance teams documented meetings between cartel representatives and transportation company managers as both sides attempted to secure loyalty or intimidate neutrality. Some companies tried to maintain relationships with both organizations, playing them against each other to maximize profits. Others chose sides and faced consequences from the rival cartel. The violence wasn't limited to cartel operatives. Civilians were caught in crossfire during shootings. Businesses were damaged or destroyed in arsons and bombings. Communities near the border lived in fear as heavily armed groups moved through their neighborhoods. The human cost of the territorial war extended far beyond those directly involved in trafficking. Intelligence indicated that CJNG's expansion into Arizona was directed from leadership in Jalisco, Mexico. The organization had assigned experienced operatives to establish footholds in Nogales, Tucson, and Phoenix. These teams were recruiting local criminals, corrupting officials, and building the infrastructure needed to move drugs through territory Sinaloa controlled. Sinaloa's response was coordinated from leadership in Culiacan. They deployed enforcement teams to eliminate CJNG operatives and demonstrate that challenges to their territory would be crushed. The organization also increased payments to corrupted officials to ensure continued loyalty and prevent CJNG from establishing competing relationships. The financial stakes were enormous. DEA analysts estimated that trafficking through Arizona generated approximately $8 billion in annual revenue for Sinaloa. Loss of these routes would severely damage the organization's economic power and ability to maintain operations throughout Mexico and the United States. CJNG understood that capturing even a portion of this revenue stream would fund their continued expansion. The conflict disrupted both organizations' operations in ways that created opportunities for law enforcement. Shipments were delayed or canceled as routes became contested. Communication security deteriorated as operatives focused on immediate tactical concerns rather than long-term operational security. The chaos generated intelligence that DEA could exploit. Federal agents identified warehouse facilities used by Sinaloa to store drugs awaiting distribution. The locations had been secure during stable operations, but the conflict forced Sinaloa to move inventory frequently to prevent CJNG from discovering and seizing it. These movements created detection opportunities that hadn't existed previously. Similarly, CJNG's attempts to establish operations revealed their personnel, methods, and objectives. Surveillance of known CJNG operatives led investigators to safe houses, meeting locations, and transportation assets. The organization's aggressive expansion made them visible in ways that careful, gradual infiltration would not have. The violence also generated cooperation from sources who previously wouldn't have assisted law enforcement. Transportation company employees who resented being caught between warring cartels provided information about how the trafficking operations functioned. Community members tired of violence occurring in their neighborhoods reported suspicious activities. The conflict created circumstances where people chose cooperation with authorities over suffering continued cartel presence. DEA coordinated with local law enforcement agencies across Arizona to enhance monitoring of areas affected by the conflict. Joint task forces combined federal resources with local knowledge to identify cartel operatives and infrastructure. The goal was to exploit the chaos to dismantle portions of both organizations while they were focused on fighting each other. The operational challenge was timing enforcement actions to maximize damage to both cartels without appearing to favor one side. If DEA targeted only Sinaloa, CJNG would benefit from reduced competition. If they focused exclusively on CJNG, Sinaloa would consolidate control. The strategy required balanced pressure on both organizations. Intelligence indicated that the conflict had created fractures within Sinaloa itself. Different factions within the organization disagreed about how aggressively to respond to CJNG's expansion. Some leaders advocated for negotiated territorial divisions to reduce violence that was attracting law enforcement attention. Others demanded total elimination of CJNG presence to prevent future challenges. These internal divisions created additional vulnerabilities. DEA identified Sinaloa operatives who were dissatisfied with leadership decisions and might be willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges or protection. Building cases against high-level cartel leadership required testimony from insiders willing to break organizational loyalty. CJNG faced different internal challenges. Their rapid expansion had required recruiting personnel who lacked experience in U.S. operations. These recruits made mistakes that experienced operatives would have avoided. They used insecure communications. They drew attention through ostentatious displays of wealth. They engaged in violence that generated witness cooperation with law enforcement. The conflict reached a peak in July when a major shipment being moved by Sinaloa was intercepted by CJNG operatives in a rural area outside Phoenix. The attempted seizure resulted in a firefight that involved over 20 participants and lasted nearly an hour. 3 CJNG operatives were killed. 5 Sinaloa members were killed. The drugs, approximately 2,000 pounds of cocaine and methamphetamine, were abandoned at the scene as survivors fled. Law enforcement arrived to find a scene resembling a military engagement. Vehicles were riddled with bullet holes. Automatic weapons and ammunition were scattered across the location. The drugs were packaged for distribution, confirming the shipment was destined for markets beyond Arizona. The incident demonstrated the scale and intensity of the cartel conflict. The abandoned drugs represented a significant financial loss for Sinaloa and a failed operation for CJNG. Both organizations had invested resources in the confrontation with nothing to show except casualties. The incident also generated extensive media coverage that increased political pressure for law enforcement action against both cartels. DEA used the publicity to justify enhanced operations. Additional personnel were assigned to Arizona. Surveillance resources were increased. Cooperation with Mexican authorities was expanded to target leadership on both sides of the border. The cartel war provided justification for enforcement actions that might have faced resistance during less violent periods. The investigation identified specific transportation routes being contested by the cartels. Interstate 19 from Nueva to Tucson was a primary corridor. Interstate 10 from Tucson through Phoenix to California was another critical route. Both organizations used a network of safe houses and transfer points along these corridors to move drugs from border crossings to distribution centers. Federal agents executed coordinated raids on safe houses identified through surveillance of the conflict. Simultaneous operations hit locations in Nogales, Tucson, Phoenix, and smaller cities along the trafficking routes. The raids seized drugs, arrested operatives from both organizations, and disrupted infrastructure both cartels relied on. The operations removed approximately 8,000 pounds of cocaine, 12,000 pounds of methamphetamine, and 600 pounds of heroin from distribution channels. The seizures represented substantial financial losses for both organizations at a time when they were already suffering from conflict-related costs. 137 individuals were arrested in the coordinated operations. Approximately 60 were affiliated with Sinaloa. 40 were connected to CJNG. The remainder were transporters, warehouse operators, and distribution personnel working for whoever paid them. The arrests removed operational capacity from both organizations simultaneously. The prosecutions revealed details about how the cartels had structured their Arizona operations. Sinaloa had divided the state into regions, each managed by a coordinator responsible for smuggling, transportation, and distribution within their territory. The coordinators reported to leadership in Mexico, but operated with significant autonomy in managing day-to-day operations. CJNG had attempted to mirror this structure as they expanded into Arizona, but their operations were less developed. They had coordinators in place in Nogales and Tucson, but hadn't established the full network of relationships and infrastructure that Sinaloa had built over years. The immaturity of their operations made them more vulnerable to law enforcement action. The financial investigation component traced money flows through both organizations. The war had been expensive. Both cartels had increased spending on weapons, personnel, and payments to maintain loyalty. Sinaloa's revenue had decreased due to disrupted operations while their costs increased. CJNG was investing heavily in expansion without yet generating significant Arizona revenue. The financial pressure created opportunities to recruit cooperating witnesses. Operatives who weren't being paid reliably due to the organization's cash flow problems were more willing to consider cooperation deals. The prosecution used this leverage to build cases against leadership figures who had previously seemed untouchable. The conflict also revealed corruption networks both cartels had established. Officials who had been taking payments from Sinaloa found themselves approached by CJNG with offers of higher compensation for switching loyalty. Some accepted, creating bidding wars for corruption that made officials more visible to internal affairs investigations. Law enforcement corruption cases were developed against 2 Border Patrol agents, a sheriff's deputy, and a DMV employee who had been providing services to the cartels. The corruption charges were separate from drug trafficking charges, but flowed from intelligence generated by the cartel conflict. The violence gradually decreased as both organizations realized the war was generating more costs than benefits. neither had achieved decisive advantage. Both had suffered losses in personnel, infrastructure, and revenue. The law enforcement pressure intensified by the conflict had damaged both operations significantly. Negotiators representing both cartels met in Mexico to discuss territorial arrangements. The discussions were tense and complicated by the violence that had occurred. Trust between the organizations had been destroyed, but economic reality forced them to find accommodation that would allow both to operate without continued warfare. The eventual arrangement divided Arizona territories. Sinaloa maintained control of primary routes through Nogales and Douglas. CJNG received access to smaller crossing points and permission to move limited quantities through Sinaloa-controlled territory in exchange for payments. Neither organization was satisfied, but both accepted the arrangement as preferable to continued conflict. DEA viewed the negotiated peace with mixed assessment. The reduction in violence was positive for public safety, but the agreement allowed both organizations to resume trafficking operations, potentially more efficiently than before, if they honored the territorial division. Law enforcement had exploited the chaos while it lasted, but stable cartel operations would be harder to disrupt. The cases built during the conflict period proceeded through prosecution. Many defendants accepted plea agreements rather than risking trial. Their cooperation provided additional intelligence about cartel operations that would inform future investigations. Some received significant sentence reductions for substantial cooperation. Others received minimal consideration because their information was less valuable. The leadership figures from both organizations who were arrested faced the most serious charges. They were prosecuted under RICO statutes for operating continuing criminal enterprises. Convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years and potential life imprisonment. The trials were lengthy and complex, requiring testimony from dozens of witnesses and presentation of thousands of documents. The infrastructure damage from the conflict took both organizations time to repair. Transportation relationships that had been disrupted needed to be rebuilt. Safe houses that had been identified by law enforcement needed to be abandoned and replaced. Personnel who had been arrested needed to be replaced with new recruits who required training. The conflict demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of cartel operations. The organizations could sustain significant damage and continue functioning, but they were vulnerable to enforcement action when internal conflicts disrupted their security and operations. The challenge for law enforcement was identifying and exploiting these opportunities when they emerged. Intelligence analysts produced assessments of how the cartel landscape had changed due to the conflict. CJNG had established a presence in Arizona that hadn't existed previously, even though it was smaller than they had hoped. Sinaloa had maintained their dominant position, but at significant cost. Both organizations were weaker than before the conflict, but both remained operational. The communities affected by the violence began recovery processes. Businesses that had been damaged or destroyed were rebuilt. Residents who had feared venturing out during the conflict's peak gradually resumed normal activities. The scars remained in memories of those killed or injured and in the economic damage caused by months of instability. The Mexican government faced pressure to address the cartel conflict's origins in territories they controlled. The violence in Arizona was an extension of competition playing out across Mexico. Without addressing the underlying power dynamics between Sinaloa and CJNG in Mexico, conflicts would continue emerging in border regions. The DEA operations in Arizona during the cartel war became a case study in exploiting organizational conflict for law enforcement advantage. Training materials emphasized the importance of readiness to capitalize on opportunities created when criminal organizations fought each other. The lessons applied beyond drug trafficking to other forms of organized crime. 5 years after the conflict, both Sinaloa and CJNG remained operational in Arizona, operating under their negotiated territorial arrangement. The agreement had held despite occasional tensions and small-scale violations. Both organizations had learned that war was expensive and attracted law enforcement attention that damaged their operations. The trafficking routes through Arizona continued moving drugs to American markets. The demand that made the territory valuable hadn't changed. The supply chains feeding that demand had been disrupted temporarily, but ultimately adapted and continued functioning. The fundamental economics driving the drug trade remained constant despite enforcement successes during the conflict period. The war between Sinaloa and CJNG had reshuffled control of trafficking infrastructure. It had exposed both organizations to law enforcement action. It had resulted in arrests, seizures, and prosecutions that damaged both cartels, but it hadn't ended drug trafficking through Arizona. New operatives replaced those arrested. New routes replaced those disrupted. The trade continued under new management, but with unchanged purpose: